This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. Can the ad targeting tools of companies like Facebook and Google be successfully exploited to change people's behaviour and the way they see the world? The fact that Facebook and Google now dominate the world's advertising markets would suggest that they do, but some of those who know these systems best remain sceptical about how effective they really are. I'm Damian Collins, and for this podcast, we'll be discussing everything you wanted to know about this subject, but were afraid to ask, with García Martínez, the author of the New York Times bestseller, Chaos Monkeys, Obscene Fortune and Random Failure in Silicon Valley. Prior to writing this book, he was the former CEO and co-founder of AdGrok, which built ad technology tools for publishers, a company which he sold to Twitter in 2011, before joining Facebook as a product manager, working in their ad targeting team. We'll also be hearing from our regular guest, the disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. Antonio, it's really great to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. This is the first time we've really spoken together, but I feel I know you a little bit, having read and greatly enjoyed your book, Chaos Monkeys. And in fact, I read that book when I was preparing for the Select Committee evidence session with Mike Trepfer, the Chief Technology Officer of Facebook. And I found it really insightful and really helped me understand sort of how some of the Facebook ad tools worked and how the platform worked. So I was very happy to give you a sort of a shout out at the time for that. And it's great to have the chance to talk about some of these issues directly.
Thank you for reading the book. Yeah, I mean, one of the weirdnesses of writing a book is that, particularly when there's a certain amount of personal information in it, as there is with Chaos Monkeys, is that you meet people who are effectively strangers who feel they really know you. So I've been through this before.
I wouldn't say I really know you, but it's certainly, I think there's a very strong, well, having not met you, I can't say there's a strong sense of you in the book, but certainly it's certainly characterful, if you see what I mean, I think. So, and I mean, I've also found it, I mean, just sort of on a practical level of just trying to understand the way a business like Facebook is set up. It's obviously a platform that has changed over its short history and the way these different tools work. And I found your book a really helpful way to try and understand the way some of the audience tools work on Facebook and the way they're designed for advertisers and they're designed to engage with people. And I think in particular, the idea that the sort of power of people's data on Facebook is not so much your own personal profile, but who else you're like, and how grouping people together with other people they have common interests with that they may not know is a really powerful way behind the way Facebook works. And I think it'd be really interesting if you could maybe give us your insights into working at Facebook at that time and how these tools were developed and how people internally marked whether or not they were successful.
Yeah, and just, I guess, by way of small personal intro, and also how did I end up at Facebook? I was basically what's called acqui-hired, i.e. it's when companies buy small companies, which used to be more common than it is now, but I had a small failing startup basically and was effectively acqui-hired partially into Twitter and then Facebook. It's a long story, it's the first half of the book. But then I basically started at Facebook in 2011, early 2011, as the first what's called product manager, and we can get into what that means, but basically the head of the ads targeting team, which didn't really have a proper product manager before I joined. Which, to give you some idea, I mean, at the time, Facebook was probably doing like $1 billion in revenue and was already about 2,000 people, and it still didn't have a lot of clear ads vision. I think one of the things that people, one of the many misconceptions I think about Facebook is that, you know, it's sort of a money-making enterprise, that Zuck is an enormously greedy sort of person. I do think he's an exceptional sort of monomaniacal person, but I don't think money is really what it's about. And as late as 2011, the ads team was really quite small. It was only about 25, 30 people. And most of us didn't know what we were doing. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. But what was interesting about my time there was that it covered that transition period when Facebook went from what still felt pretty amateurish and almost startup-y, passed through the IPO and the pressure of actually making a business out of it. And it was right in that time that most of the tools, it's funny, I was talking to a Facebook PM recently off the record, and he also conceded that basically everything that Facebook makes money off of was kind of invented and launched between sort of 2012 and 2014. So yeah, that I was basically given the mandate of take Facebook user data in some form or another, or outside data, which is part of the story, and use it to increase Facebook's monetization. That was my goal.
Yeah. And well, you succeed. You and your colleagues succeeded. It'd be fair to say. I mean that's a really interesting point, because I think that a lot of people would assume that it's a free service. Therefore, Facebook gathers data about what I do when I'm on Facebook, and it uses that data to try and optimize my experience, to make sure I'm probably engaging with the sort of content that I'm most likely to be interested in based on the stuff I've been interested in the past. But I think one of the things that people didn't really appreciate quite so much was how much data is collected about you off of Facebook. And I think even the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, their recent report on the digital ad market said, I think in the UK context, Facebook have more data about you off Facebook than they have on Facebook.
That's absolutely right, and I'm glad the commission came to that conclusion, because that's basically the truth, and I think that's also another misconception from Facebook. I mean, I think the mental model that many people have around Facebook, and it's totally forgivable because Facebook is weird and it's hard to understand how these things work. But I think the mental model they have is, Mark Zuckerberg is listening to your conversations through your microphone on your phone or something, right? And I've actually written a piece about that. It's the rumor that'll never die. I want to address it here, but basically it's technically almost impossible. And even if he were doing that, it wouldn't be terribly valuable, because a lot of the data, and this is what we learned this is the very hard lesson we learned around 2011, 2012, that a lot of the data Facebook collects from the strict advertising point of view is not terribly valuable. So for example, what page you've liked a year and a half ago, or even lots of the content you engage with on Facebook doesn't really have a lot of commercial interest there. You can write these sort of just so stories of like, oh, what if I mentioned going to the shop to get dog food or something, then couldn't you show me a dog ad or something? I mean, you can write these little stories, but if you think about doing it at scale that Facebook would need to do it at, it just kind of falls apart. And so I think what you're putting your finger on is, let me turn around one of the sort of misconceptions of Facebook. People always say Facebook sells your data. The reality is that Facebook kind of buys your data, actually, is what it does. And it doesn't literally buy it like with cash, but it basically creates an ad system or an analytic system, a way of basically tracking user behavior on phone or on desktop, and makes it so valuable that advertisers are willing to use their data to target users on Facebook. So for example, and this is all, open public record. You can find docs about it on the Facebook developer website. If you go and let me try to use a UK reference. I guess your Tesco discount card. Is that a correct reference still? I'm trying to find what the equivalent of Costco is.
Yeah, club card, they call it, yeah.
Right, I only know because it's actually a case study in the business world, at the Tesco card. I've never been inside a Tesco. But, if you use that card, it's tied to other pieces of data like your email or your phone number. If you go to a website, for example, if you look at your browser, you might see that a small little piece of the website actually went to facebook.com. That what they're basically doing is collecting data outside that world and effectively intermediating identity. And what I mean by identity is, and identity is absolutely critical in modern advertising, is Facebook knows how to find someone online on almost every device they touch. Because of course, what's the first thing you do when you buy a phone? You install Facebook and you log in, right? And that links your behavior on Facebook with your work machine, with your home machine, with everything, right? And that provides a very coherent picture on you as a consumer and you as a person. And so, instead of, I think people shouldn't think about it as like, oh, my Facebook data is being mined in some way. It's more like, you're using Facebook. Facebook knows where you are because you use the app a lot, and that's a very convenient way to join it to outside data. Now, of course, there's a subtle point here. There is some data that Facebook uses, which is to come up with a graph of people like you. And it's funny, this is one of the more overlooked Facebook ads products for whatever reason, even though it's one of the most successful. It also started in the period when I was there. I was not involved with it at all, but it was seeded when I was there, and it's called lookalike audiences. And what that means is, and this addresses a classic problem to the modern advertiser, which is, here I've got 1 million customers who I know have spent money on my website or service. And, Facebook, go and find me 2 or 3 million other consumers just like this one, right? That's the perpetual problem of your typical advertiser. And Facebook can do that because it knows the people you've interacted with and things you've interacted with. So a lot of your Facebook data actually isn't used itself to target ads, but it's used to figure out who you're like, right? And in that sense, help manage that ad delivery process. It's kind of a very subtle second order thing, but it's very real.
And I think this is.
Let me pause for a moment. I've got my Slack on, so you're hearing the notifications, and there's this one
Sure.
annoying employee who constantly bothers me. So let me turn it off because
Okay.
you're hearing the notifications.
I thought this was a really important point, and that
Are you still there, Damian?
Yes, I am. Yes, yeah. No, I think lookalike audiences are really interesting, and it's something we actually talked to Mike Schrefer about in the hearings, and we've certainly talked about on this podcast before, which is that, if you're a business and you can say to Facebook, well, here's some data I have about how my customers who are on Facebook, and I want you to find me other people that match that 10,000 people that are the closest match to this set of people that I've got, and that's one thing if you're selling baked beans. It's quite another thing if you're selling political ideas and you're using it to target people with maybe niche views, maybe even people that hold quite extreme views. And these ad tools could have quite a big impact on society potentially if they're used in that way. And I know that YouTube have turned off their similar product, Customer Match, for targeting people with political ads on YouTube. And I'd be interested in your view on with lookalike audiences on Facebook. I mean, do you think it is potentially quite powerful in this context? And do you think its role should be limited depending on what people want to advertise?
That's a good question. I think I am on board with the thought that political advertising is a different beast, and therefore different rules apply. Like you said, you're not trying to get people to buy a can of baked beans.
Yeah.
I usually use a pair of shoes as the example, but you are right that it's different. Democracy or our government is at stake, and there's definitely a precedent in other forms of media. There's different rules around how political advertising works there. So I think I'm on board with that. I do wonder, though, here's the other side of the regulation question, which I assume we were going to broach at some point in this conversation, right? Which is, it's so difficult to create tech regulation that, in fact, is either completely ineffectual, right, and just doesn't do anything, or creates various forms of regulatory capture that are going to be exploited. When people raise regulation, they always cite the sort of wonderful examples of, whatever, the FDA or seatbelt laws or whatever. But, they never cite sort of the tax code, for example, right? Yeah. Which at this point, whatever that Norwegian model is, where you just fill out an index card and send it or something and everyone just pays and it's all public, like that's obviously preferable than the US tax code right now. And so, I get the point that it's dangerous, but I mean, you kind of have to be a cultural chameleon to inhabit our current society, right? So I think that the colors I'm going to shift into is that of the slightly libertarian sort of chameleon at the moment. And I just wonder how much of this is actually driven by, in some sense, the wrong people having won the last set of elections, right? The Guardian has this sort of very funny piece in 2012, kind of lauding the Obama digital team for having pulled off, and I hate to mention this thing because I'm so tired of talking about it, but pulling off a somewhat similar hack to the Cambridge Analytica thing, right? And it just seems, again, it's odd to me that I think a lot of this regulatory pressure is due to sort of correcting the past. That said, I do think some of these pushes have been good. For example, Facebook's ad archive that actually gives an unprecedented level of disclosure, I think is probably a good thing, and they probably should have done that in the past. So I don't know, I'm of two minds about it. I'm like, on the one hand, yes, it's dangerous. On the other hand, and this just gets back to like, what is the history of advertising as it exists on Facebook? You realize when we were building what is now called custom audiences, and again, I was part of a group of people, but it was a small group and I was part of it. When we were building custom audiences, we were absolutely emulating direct mail. We didn't, the internet didn't invent this sort of, what do they call it these days? Hyper-targeting or something, which isn't even a term of art inside ad tech, but whatever, everyone knows what it means now. Facebook didn't invent hyper-targeting, right? We were absolutely emulating the direct mail marketers that have been doing this for 30 or 40 years, right? And so I just wonder how it's odd that suddenly different rules sort of apply in the Facebook space rather than every other form of media that exists. Yeah. And so that's my very fuzzy take on it.
Yeah, no. But I suppose this question has it just moved on massively? Because I remember reading there's a kind of seminar series that Harvard do, I think at the Kennedy Center, where they get the campaign managers after an election cycle in to talk to discuss their campaigns, and they do it every 4 years. And I was looking at the one from the 2016 election series, and there was someone who was a campaign manager for Ted Cruz talking about the Iowa caucus, and I haven't got, I didn't know we were going to talk about this, so I haven't got the figures in front of me, but it's something like this manager made the point that when Obama ran for re-election, he used different targeting groups on social media for advertising, and they had about 8 different groups that they targeted. When Ted Cruz ran in the Iowa caucus, they had something like 150 different target groups that they they had different advertising messages too. And I suppose the technology makes that possible. But that to me suggests that the amount of data that must be being tied to voters to make that sort of targeting worthwhile must be far greater than it was sort of 8-10 years ago.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I actually know a little bit about this. In my 2 or 3 years as sort of a journalist after the book, in 2018, I did a story for Wired on the Texas midterms. And one of the good things, in general, I didn't like journalist life, but one of the good things about being a journalist, particularly from an institution with a certain level of prestige, is that you can just call people and ask them to answer your questions, and they do. Right? And so I way over-reported what I thought was kind of a mediocre story, but I did end up talking to the CTOs of both parties at the time, like the national parties, like the RNC and the DNC, as well as the CEOs of various political ad tech companies. Believe it or not, there's just like there's commercial ad tech companies, there's entire political, ad agencies. The only difference is that in the political world, they're actually labeled by party. In other words, the same agency can't work for both parties. There's an entire Republican infrastructure and there's an entire Democrat infrastructure, and they never talk to each other. It's definitely the case that it seems as if there's been a tide where a lot of this commercial sort of know-how and skill and sophistication has finally gotten into the political world. And in fact, that's one of the pieces I wrote for Wired, that I think the story about 2016 wasn't the Russian hacking thing, it wasn't Cambridge Analytica. It was just that in the case of Brad Parscale on the Trump campaign, it seems like they lean pretty hard into the Facebook custom audiences and targeting thing, right? And it seems like the Clinton campaign did not, right? And it seems like it was one of these inflection points in which a large national campaign, did what Amazon would do. And I think, in fact, there's a quote from a piece in, I think it was the New Yorker, in which I think it's the only interview or inside reporter the campaign ever had. Parscale, you'll excuse my salty language, I assume the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction in Britain, but he said something like, we're just running, I forget exactly what he said. It's basically, it's all the same shit as commercial. We're just retargeting them through Facebook, blah, blah, blah. He made sort of a very crude, vulgar statement, but it was basically true. I mean, he was just running the campaign the way that Bed Bath & Beyond, which is this national purveyor of like bathroom and kitchen stuff, spams Americans with coupons and ads and whatnot. So I think you're right. Yes, there's a level of sophistication there. I just wonder though, I don't know. It just seems odd to me, I guess, in some sense, that you would have a different set of rules for selling a politician versus selling a can of beans. But
yeah, I suppose in a way, maybe it depends where you are in the world as well, because in the UK we do have different rules already. There's some, and certainly that you can't use TV, for example, to advertise and for political candidates. And so I suppose there's always been that tradition that politics is treated slightly differently. But I mean, looking at some of the news stories around Facebook's sort of ad tools and where it's been problematic, it seems to be where different ad tools are being used to target people with quite extremist views. There was the LA Times did that story about the fact they discovered you could buy ad groups on Facebook for people who had a strong interest in the Nazis. There have been sort of concerns around targeting people who've hold anti-Semitic views. There was also slightly different, but because it's not about ad targeting, but about the way data is used to make recommendations. The fact that people were, I think this was a study done in Germany where 60% of people that had joined Facebook groups which had extremist content had done so at the recommendation of Facebook. And I just wonder, is there, what we're looking at here is tools that have really been created to sell commercial products, but also do lap over into opinions, ideas, maybe extremist movements as well, and then can play a rather unhelpful role in driving people towards more extreme content.
Yeah, I remember the case of the targeting thing. I think it was pretty sure it was ProPublica, I think, that did the first story about that. It's funny because that was a system I did work on. That was one of the first things I launched when I joined Facebook. Not those specific targeting clusters, but the general system that created that.
Yeah.
That obviously was an error. Facebook is a company run by two practicing Jews. I don't think they're secretly anti-Semitic.
Yes, indeed.
Obviously, but and obviously the cluster shouldn't have existed, and Facebook should have pulled them down. But one thing I would say, here's one I feel I'm always brought on these podcasts or these things, right? Because I'm obviously a slightly contrarian or not mainstream take. And so here's one opinion from inside this beast that we call ad tech that pays for the internet, right? Here's one thing I think people don't quite realize. Ads don't work nearly as well as people seem to think they do, right? I mean, it's odd to me in this entire conversation, I've said it before, it's so ironic to me that, those who know least about how ad tech works are the ones willing most to believe that's, Cambridge Analytica or whatever, that some little company with a little bit of data could just totally throw an election in a country of 300 million. While those who are actually in the ad tech world are the ones that are the most skeptical about all these claims because they've actually worked with the data and they realize that it doesn't work nearly as well. And of course, I say that and people will say, well, then why are they spending money on it? And I think, as with everything, nothing is a binary, everything is a continuum. And I think what people don't realize is, do you want me to spend can you give me 30 seconds just to walk through how modern advertising works? Okay. So and again, I think it's great. And Damian, you obviously know this world very well and all that, but but I think sometimes it's worth getting into what are the actual numbers involved. Yeah. So how can it be true that on the one hand, digital advertising is this, multi-billion-dollar industry that floats companies like Facebook that are worth almost $1 billion. And how can I say, oh, by the way, most ads don't work, right? Let's just walk through how it actually looks like, right? So say you're a retailer, say you're even a politician, right? And you've got what's called the voter rolls in the US, basically the name and the registered address of voters, right? Which is a piece of information you would upload to Facebook and try to create a targeting segment or whatever. You've got some piece of targeting that you want to deploy on Facebook. You run your ad, right? You'll have what's called the CTR, click-through rate of, call it 0.5%, right? So let's just put some numbers on it. Let's say you target 1,000 people, right? And you end up having a click-through rate of something like 0.5%. That'd be slightly on the low side for Facebook. It'd be very high for regular internet ads, but that's a order what it would be. So out of the 1,000 people who saw your ad, 995 completely and utterly ignored it, had no memory of it, didn't register. They have no clue that any of it happened, right? Five people actually click on whatever that thing is. They land on your website and say 20% of them, which on the higher side representative, goes and buys something, right? So at the end of the day, you've had one person out of 1,000 actually buy your thing, right? 999 were complete failures, right? How does this work? Well, if it costs you $5, right, to reach those 1,000 people, that would be a $5 what's called CPM, cost per mil, cost per 1,000 ads, which is the sort of cost per square foot of internet real estate. If you spent $5 to reach them, but that one person bought a $10 thing, well, you've had 100% return on advertising spend, ROAS as it's called, right? So that ad worked from the ROI perspective, right? But again, to reiterate, 999 people, it didn't really do much for them at all, right? And I think that's the reality. So when you hear things like, a lot of this was in the rhetoric of the 2016. It's there was, whatever it was, 80,000 swing state voters or whatever it was in the state of Ohio. And the reach of this dinky little Russian op page, it might have had 10,000 followers. And if each one of them had 7 retweets, and they do this whole math and they think that if, so much as one Facebook post reaches one person, that's it. They're suddenly a Trump zombie. And it's just, I read these accounts as someone who works in ad tech and I'm like, if only ads were even remotely as effective as you're claiming in the statement, right? I mean, my life would be so much easier. So that's my take on how ads can both work from a financial point of view, but not necessarily have the almost supernatural power that they're credited with.
Yeah. Now for me, that poses a really interesting question, and a question I remember asking people, Facebook executives in meetings around the time we were doing our hearings, which is because Facebook always, when you asked about say Russian interference, they would always try and steer the conversation back to Facebook pages and ads. And indeed, when they were eventually sort of shamed or embarrassed or pressured into looking for evidence of Russian ads at the request of the Senate Intelligence Committee, that's what they came back with. It wasn't a general trawl of other Russian activity. It was looking very specifically at ads and ad spend. And I remember asking executives, are there other ways in which you can try and get content to manipulate content going viral through the platform? And they said, well, the only way you can drive content through Facebook is through advertising. But I said at the time, well, what about groups? And Facebook, it always struck me, they never provided any information about activity in Facebook groups. And actually, if you were trying to maybe make something go viral on Facebook, coordinated networks of Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of people in could be a more effective way of doing it than placing adverts. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
yeah, that's obviously Facebook kind of dodging the question a little bit.
Yeah.
Facebook PR, and I say this as a former employee, is famous for kind of obfuscating, as every PR team is, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, they're obviously kind of avoiding the question there. I think it's absolutely a completely legitimate question to ask. Well, but what about the organic distribution, right? Because obviously the Russians, I think the number was something like $100,000 in ad spend, which is nothing, right? You cannot win anything with $100,000 in ad spend. But you're right to ask, well, what does it look like on the organic side, right? I do think they went on the record in one of the congressional hearings in which they actually cited some of the distribution there. And again, here's another piece of news from the inside, right? That I take it as my job in these interviews to sort of publicize, because I think it's the one, like, I don't claim to know the answers here. I don't think anybody does, actually. But I think something what's missing, the missing piece of the puzzle is, like, what is the inside view, right? And admittedly, this is somewhat dated, but if this was true, however many years ago, then it's even more true now that Facebook is twice as big as it was when I was there, right? I think one thing that people don't understand about Facebook, and again, it's totally understandable because it's a bizarre situation, is the scale of Facebook is just astonishing, right? Like, Facebook is effectively something like a quarter to a third of the internet in every country except China, right? Full stop. That's basically what it is in terms of traffic, engagement, bandwidth. There's various ways you can slice the data, but that's how big Facebook is, particularly if you look across all three properties, right? Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And that is just enormous, right? And so when, someone gets up and says, oh, there was this Russian group with, 100,000 members or something, it's like, well, that wouldn't even appear in a top 100,000 groups in the US list for Facebook, right? Yeah. Or if you looked at, specifically the groups, I'm not so sure, because a lot of that's private, so you can't really see from the outside. But in terms of, like, how far does information disseminate, I think put it this way, the denominator, right, in all these analyses, and again, you can't just cite a number. Getting back to my case of, like, the mythical 60,000 voters in Ohio, whatever, you can't just cite an absolute number and not divide it by some other number when you're talking about Facebook, because I think you'll mislead yourself, right? And so if you actually look at the distribution for a lot of these groups, and I recall doing this back when I was writing for Wired, there's this company called CrowdTangle that actually tracks public posts and actually has pretty good data on how popular certain posts are, how popular certain pages. I'm sure you've used it, Damian.
Yeah.
And it's pretty good, actually. But I actually took when that, whatever that report came out, it was either the one that Renee did or maybe something from your office. But at some point, a report came out with actually, like, a list of the 30 groups, right? Yeah. And so I looked them up on CrowdTangle, and indeed, the traffic wasn't zero. It wasn't like nothing. But if you compared it to, Fox News, if you compared it to just other large media pages, it was kind of nothing in the scheme of things, right? And so I think it's just hard. I think Facebook actually did cite a number in that congressional hearing as, like, what fraction was this of total pre-election media? And it was something like hundredths of a percent, right? And in fact, knowing what I knew at the time, and the numbers haven't changed too much, I also did a back of the envelope about, like, okay, like, given this page and how many pages they posted, like, what fraction of the US populace did they reach? And it was something of also order hundredths of a percent, right? And so, meaning, in other words, like, the average American maybe saw one such post in the entire year, right? And to go from that to think that, oh, well, then that just completely threw the election. It's just hard to believe. All that said, I'm not discounting that. Here's the other thing, right? Here's why I feel so conflicted in these interviews. Because on the one hand, I'm a little bit skeptical about some of the claims, right? That like, the Russians actually completely threw the election. On the other hand, it is absolutely true that Facebook is a force in the political world in a way that it wasn't in 2012.
Yeah.
So in some sense, I broadly agree, I think, with a lot of the commentary, but I disagree with the specifics. Just to give you an idea of how much things have changed, as I mentioned, Facebook was a pretty small team at the time. It was fairly chaotic, with absolutely no qualifications whatsoever for about, I think, 9 months. I led what used to be called the ad quality team. I think now it's called ad integrity team. It's basically the ads police, right? That the team that polices ads and makes sure that it follows Facebook standards. And at the time, there was so little political advertising on Facebook. And we're talking 2012, right? Supposedly the digital election of Obama. They didn't actually spend that much in the scheme of things, right? There was so little political advertising on Facebook. We didn't even have a playbook around political advertising, right? It was not something I was even worried about. I was worried about, like, scam iPad offers from Turkey, right? That was the biggest worry, right? The thought that this would undermine the longest running experiment in democracy since the Greeks, right? I mean, if you had told me that in 2012, I would have laughed in your face, right? So, and in some sense, I think a lot of this pressure has forced Facebook to wake up, which I think is a good thing. But getting back to the question about the scale, it's really easy, I think, as a journalist or as an outsider to pick some particular situation, pick some story, whatever, some Alex Jones, horror show or something, right? And like say, aha, Facebook took a day to like take this down or whatever. But you realize every day there's like 10,000 Alex Jones things flying on Facebook, right? And the people in charge are still human and limited, and the tools are limited. I mean, the level to which things need to get such that you're the top line item on any Facebook dashboard is just unreal, right? And I think that's part of the disconnect. And some might say, I've told this to people, I don't want to cite names, and it's like, well, that's just an argument for breaking them up. They've clearly gotten too big to manage themselves. And to be honest, I don't have an answer for that. In some sense, I guess that's sort of true. I don't know what would replace it, though, even if you did that, though.
But I think it's interesting because I think a lot of what we've talked about on this podcast has been also disinformation about coronavirus, and I think it's I get the sense it's sort of heightened people's awareness of this topic, because a lot of people would said to me, certainly looking at Russian interference in elections, well, there's nothing I've ever seen on Facebook which has persuaded me to vote one way rather than the other. I make up my own mind. And I think people do feel like that about politics, regardless of where the influences come from that shape the way they see issues. But on something like coronavirus, which is then something that comes along that's new, there's a lot we don't know about it, and therefore people are interested in understanding more. But we've also then seen conspiracy theories, spiking on social media, influencing the way people behave. People in the UK set fire to mobile phone masts because they believed that 5G signals were causing coronavirus. And I think that's led people to question there to say, well, okay, notwithstanding everything you say, Facebook, about the way your systems work, people seem to be pretty effective at getting conspiracy theories to spread. And, the anti-vaccine movement is, I think, another really good example of how actually some people may even say, well, whatever tools they're using, these movements are actually starting to crowd out legitimate public health information that people should be hearing.
Yes. I mean, the corona topic is the bigger one. And here's where I get slightly philosophical, Damian, and start talking about the second book idea that I was working on that I kind of paused while I rejoined the tech fray. I mean, it's true, and again, not to get too tinfoil hat about it, but the official position on corona and masks and all the rest of it, of even the approved authorities, the CDC and whatever the analog is in the UK, has been so equivocal about what we should actually be doing for corona, right? First, they were, I remember this, they were super anti-mask, which seemed mind-boggling to me. And then eventually they were pro-mask, and now everyone has their own opinion and whatnot. I really think what you're seeing, and I know this sounds a little philosophical, is that you're seeing the death of, I think, expertise and elite opinion and elite distribution, right? I know this is somewhat cliche, but I think the comparison to the rise of the printing press and the Reformation is actually a very good one. And the more that I read about that period, and I've read a decent amount at this point, the more parallels I find between our modern day world and the late 15th century in Europe. Because you had an analogous scenario where, I mean, in that case, it was due to limited literacy and the establishment of religion and all the rest of it. Now it's mostly the legacy of mass market industrial era media, which is kind of dying at this point, right? But I definitely do think that you see the lifting of the monopoly. Put it this way, the fact that we've essentially put a network smartphone in almost everyone on the planet's pocket, right? Marshall McLuhan talked about digital media as the human nervous system extending all over the globe, right? Basically, my eyes and ears are in everyone's pocket, and everyone's eyes and ears are in my pocket, right? And that is just a completely different change that even Marshall McLuhan sort of didn't kind of see coming, right? Because he was still living in this very centralized, mass media world, right? And I think in that world, it's very difficult to establish any sort of authority and throttle any sort of opinion, right? And so I'm just, I mean, you're right in that obviously there's a lot of misinformation out there, and the anti-vax movement, which actually causes real public health harm and all the rest of it. But it's difficult, I think, put it this way, and now it seems dated, right? But it seems odd to me that people are sort of wary of Facebook and Zuck, and there are reasons to be. I mean, there's a chapter in my book in which I'm somewhat critical of him and his ambitions. But they respond by trying to give him more power, by making him editor-in-chief, right? And, I'm still pretty cagey about decisions being made about what we can read being made in closed-door conference rooms at Facebook, as nostalgic as I might be from my former employer.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder about that. And yeah, I mean, that's a tightrope that nobody can effectively walk. I mean, look at it now, right? It's like liberals are convinced that, Facebook helped get Trump elected, which, I mean, they did, if you just look at the ad side of it, but I think they're making a broader claim, right? That the nature of Facebook made it such that somebody like Trump could rise. But on the other hand, you have conservatives accusing Zuck of actually censoring their opinions, right? Like literally, it's like Schrodinger's Facebook. Which is it? Are they against the left, against the right? Which one are they supposedly suppressing? And I mean, both sides are somewhat wrong, right? And so I think the human mind, here's my hope. Okay, like how are we going to avoid the 30 Years' War, right? Which was the hyper-violent conflict that happened in the early 17th century after a year of religious turmoil due to the printing press. I hope to think that humans will culturally adapt to this situation. And a lot of this confusion we're seeing is the human mind going from a place where central authorities kind of mattered and where you expected truth to be this non-negotiable commodity in media to one where you understand that it's this clamor of voices which happen to have potentially national distribution. And somehow out of that, some semblance of the world we live in manages to survive. Yeah. But I think a lot of the conversation, and I know it sounds like the typical Silicon Valley futurist kind of wanker, right? Like, oh, I'm living in the future. But a lot of the conversations, even very smart people who are in media and whatnot, are like so trying to, it's like every part of the political spectrum wants to go back in time. The only question is, what year do you want to go back to, right? The Trumpers want to go back to 1952. The Clinton liberals want to go back to 1992. Everyone just wants a time machine to go back in time and reset to some point in which they thought the institutions in the world were a rights, right? Yeah. And I have trouble sympathizing with that attitude, and I think there's no way back to those worlds.
There is, just a final question for me before I'd like to bring Charles into the discussion. And that's, we've talked about this in the podcast before, and again, looking back, there have been times in history where new media has developed and goes through a period of seeming to be extraordinarily influential. So in the 30s, it was certainly radio. And I was looking at an old New York Times article about the creation of the FCC, where it was quite clear that they wanted to make sure that people had fair access to it, that it couldn't be dominated by certain political voices, that it couldn't be dominated by foreign ownership. And there was a sense that it essentially was quite a dangerous tool if you allowed those things to happen. And again, going back to the question of regulation here, is there a question of looking at the way social media has become the kind of dominant media and the lens through which people see the world in many ways, and yet there's no regulatory environment around that. It's a free for all, and where the biggest pylon behind even the most batty idea can actually become the received wisdom.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a precedent there, right? The equal time laws that I imagine there's some equivalent in the UK, or maybe there's just like no time laws where you can't TV, like you mentioned. But in the US, there was this notion of, I forget the exact stipulation, but basically in local TV markets, you had to give equal time to one side or the other. I think actually it wasn't equal time, it was equal rates. You couldn't charge one way. Yeah. Right. There's definitely a precedent there. How that would actually even function in the sort of newsfeed driven algorithmic world of Facebook, I think a lot of details you'd have to iron out there. But it doesn't sound completely crazy, I guess. I hate to be that sort of Silicon Valley guy, but I think we're just, this notion that there's a centralized media, a central point of control that in collaboration with government, sets the stage for the national media market. That just seems like such a dated concept to me. I don't think that's going to work going forward.
Yeah, no, I think it'd be totally unworkable to have a sort of central position that sought to control everything. But I suppose it's a question of saying, should there be some rules of the road, and what sort of responsibility do the companies have when it's their recommendation tools and their targeting tools that can be exploited to make sure that bad stuff goes viral?
Sure. I'd love if there was actually a sort of level playing field set of rules one could actually use here. But I just feel so often that it's kind of like it's democracy when my guy wins, but it's populism when the other guy wins, right? It just seems like, oh, this was a brilliant digital strategy when my guy wins, and the most horrible abuse of this devilish technology when the other guy wins.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you mediate that. And I don't say that again as someone who's trying to make a political statement. Like I'm looking at it from the purely hard-nosed like tech point of view of like the person in the middle who just is looking at a usage and revenue graph and in a somewhat hard-nosed and mercenary fashion doesn't care about anything else. So I don't know how you manage that. Again, like this will sound super philosophically and like after the third bong hit at some media studies department, but capital T truth, right? I don't think exists outside of either mathematical theorems or scientific laboratories, right? I don't think it's ever existed. I mean, if you go, and to some degree, and I don't mean to sound too cynical, but the news has always been fake, right? The difference is that these contrived narratives always sort of existed within the prescribed boundaries of political and linguistic borders, right? I mean, I can show you a clear example. Go read a book on Napoleon by the Brits versus the French, right? Or go read about a story about the colonization of the Americas from the English-speaking side versus the Spanish-speaking side. I was raised in a Spanish language society, right? So I kind of saw the other side of the coin. Yeah. And you go and read a placard at some American park somewhere, and you hear a very different story, right? And again, these narratives were kept self-consistent within that world and helped that society navigate reality. But I don't think none of them were capital T truth, right? The difference now is that narrative is not being kept self-consistent. And in some sense, the patchwork quilt of opinion and belief that characterizes our age, those borders, right, pass underneath and through the colored squares on the map called the United States of America or the United Kingdom, or as the case may be, right? And so there isn't a common truth or a common narrative anymore. Right. And I think the internet absolutely created that, not just Facebook, although Facebook was part of it. And so the question is, what do you do after that? And I don't think there's any amount of regulation you can pass that will force that will force like the map of belief and narrative, right? The fact that, some MAGA hat Trumper in the US has more in common with a Brexiteer, right, than they maybe do with some blue city resident just 30 miles down the road. Like what do you do with that? How do you put that genie back in the bottle, right? I frankly just don't see a way to do it.
I suppose that there is, as you say, there have always been conflicting narratives about events. I mean, I suppose the truth is that often the events happened, the events took place, but people interpret them in different ways. And I think that's political debate just as much as debate between historians. I don't think you can do anything about that. I suppose what troubles me is when there are certain things we could say, and the anti-vaccine movement, I think it could be a good example of this. There are things we could say, well, this is not true and it's harmful and we should be worried about it. And we should be trying to think of what we can do to stop speech that is going to lead directly to harm.
Yeah, and just to be clear, so I don't come off as like one of these crazy like free speech absolutists, which I'm not. Like I do think, Facebook does have the right and certainly to some degree the responsibility to actually moderate. I mean, moderate is the current euphemism, basically censor content off of Facebook, right? Obviously, extreme violence, pornography, obviously, the grooming of children and, other horrors, Facebook very aggressively polices, and I think they entirely have the right to. I mean, the difference there, of course, is that like 99% of Facebook users do not want to log into Facebook and see porn or see some crazy violent video, right? So there's like little debate about what the standard there is, right? It's like the classic joke, it's hard to define pornography, but everyone knows it when they see it, right? And so I think everyone knows it when they see it. But, I think political extremism, right, as a concept is, again, a much harder definition to get 99% of Facebook to agree to. Yeah. That to me is the problem. It's like, how do you craft a standard that actually can be applied equally in such a politically polarized age, in which, again, I think this is probably less the case in Europe, although, I mean, you would be the experts, but I think in the US, the two political tribes are trending in a direction in which even their underlying values are fundamentally different, right? Like, I don't think they have the same values anymore. And how do you come up with a common standard in that world? I don't know. It seems really challenging to me.
Charles, you've been listening in to the discussion. It's great to have you on the podcast again. Well, I'm interested in your thoughts on this and also what's caught your attention in the last few days.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting listening to the conversation because what I'm reminded of, and specifically, Antonio, when you were speaking about how Facebook ads are not as magically effective as people want to say that they are, we heard this same argument come from Alexander Kogan, for example, who went to great lengths to explain to us that you can't take someone from the middle and move them all the way to the left and all the way to the right. But and we've heard the same argument from other people. It seems like whenever someone needs to defend their practice, they decide it's time to say, well, my practice doesn't really work, so it shouldn't count. But, in fact, that's not what the effort is. Take someone who is already out in the left or already out in the right and just push them a little bit farther, just push them into activism or push them into deciding to stay home from from voting. And that can indeed swing an election.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you talk, and again, the political advertising world is not my specialty. I've spent most of my career just in your basic commercial advertising. Like I said, the political advertising world is kind of it's world apart. But if you talk to those people, what they say is like the swing voter is kind of mythical, and it's not really the goal. The goal is what they call GOTV, right? Get out the vote, right? Get people who are excited to show up. And elections are won by such slim margins that if you get a 1% better turnout in certain counties, indeed, it can change the election. So and look, and I agree that, I can see how. Are you still there, by the way?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. You cut out for a second. I thought maybe I'd lost you again. I agree that it's a little bit, squirrely or kind of cynical for ad people to say, oh, well, but don't worry about it. It doesn't work that well. Again, I think it's a nuanced statement. I don't know what Kogan was saying, but I at least, I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying it can work, and it works out financially, which is why the industry exists. I just think the impact on the political side isn't nearly as big as you might think. Put it another way, it's easier to sell somebody a pair of shoes using retargeting and a 10% off coupon than it is to convince them to vote for whoever, right? Again, the weird thing to me, and again, I don't mean to say this and make any sort of political statement about it, but it's just odd to me that so much of the conversation it's always like, oh, this is the wonderful case. And then the Facebook PR team does this all the time, right? They try to find some like unqualifiedly positive thing, like, for example, what was it? The teacher strikes a couple of years ago were actually organized on Facebook groups, right? And so they kind of talk about that. But it's, I don't know. Yeah, sorry, I'm just rambling at this point. If you want to have a follow-up question, Charles, sorry.
That's okay. The other thing that I would say is that, we're talking about this creation of a kind of top-down voice and that there being no common truth. And I think that actually, there was not a more common truth in the past than there is a common truth now. But what there was a dominant narrative because the writing of narrative wasn't as available to as many people as there is now. There weren't as many voices involved with it that could be heard. But what we do have now that can be done is the creation of a dominant narrative. But if the creation of that narrative is as distributed as the audience's voice is. So if I'm the Internet Research Agency, I'm not going to manage this with one Twitter account. I'm going to need 40,000 bot accounts, some of which I'm going to convert into trolls. And that trolling is going to do a great deal of work. And then we find ourselves in the situation that we're in now, say on Twitter, where if you have a leading commentator, if you read through the comments section of a commentator's post, what you find is a bunch of professional trolls talking to other professional trolls, but they are managing to wrench a narrative into being. And I think that really does exist, and it's a real problem that's out there.
Yeah. I haven't been exposed to it too often, but the couple times I've mentioned China, there's been some suspiciously low follower count accounts that just showed up and made the exact same reply.
Low follower count, Mr. Name and number, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I don't doubt at all that bot networks exist. I do wonder what the scale of that is compared to the overall scale, though. But that's the other thing, by the way, that it's hard to figure out, to even be self-aware about your media world, because you don't realize how blind you kind of are, right? That's the whole point of a bubble, right? And again, we've all lived in various bubbles. Like I've had 4 different careers in my life, and every every industry was its own little bubble, right? And I've lived in different parts of the world, and they all live in their own cultural and intellectual bubbles. I think the US lives in a pretty dense bubble. It just happens to span most of the world, so they don't quite realize that, in fact, they're in a bubble.
Oxford Internet Institute has produced some really interesting studies, and what they've found is that in many spaces of public discourse in social media, in fact, the conversation is mostly dominated by professional trolls and bots. So it's curious. I mean, we're often, when we're watching social media conversation, we're looking at trolls battling with trolls, and all of them are being paid to do the kind of work.
Yeah, I'm guessing I'm probably not the target of those trolls.
Damian, let me tell you what I've been having a look at this week. You know, we've been spending a lot of time on Infotagion and talking about the dangers around disinformation and the threats to democracies, the threat to a stable world order, and in some cases encouraging authoritarianism, Donald Trump. But we also do a pretty fair share of hand-wringing over the possibility that it could actually be a direct danger to our health, and the disinformation surrounding COVID is a good result of that. But there's a new study now that actually confirms this. A study published in the American Journal of Topical Medicine and Hygiene detailed how online conspiracy theories and misinformation relating to COVID-19 have resulted in at least 800 deaths specifically from coronavirus. It details some examples of 3 different categories of harmful information. First, misleading rumors, then conspiracy theories, and then some stigma surrounding the pandemic. The rumors include notions like you should drink bleach for COVID, or drink hand sanitizer, or even cow urine. False conspiracy theories, the second category, include the very popular notion that COVID-19 is a weapon funded by Bill Gates, as well as ideas that COVID-19 was engineered to damage Trump's re-election chances. Now, this all sounds relatively benign, but it's worth noting that the WHO has declared that disinformation about COVID is spreading faster than the virus itself. And while we should at least be grateful for that bit, we should also be kind of wary, because also, according to the WHO, the worst countries for disinformation are also the worst countries for infection, including the US, Brazil, India, and Spain. And in fact, more than 7 million pieces of disinformation were shared online from April to June. And do you want to guess at the most popular?
Go on.
COVID's caused by 5G.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've never understood that conspiracy theory. Like, I don't even get the fantastical causality that would cause that. But, okay.
I keep trying to chase the money and figure out who that benefits.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it persists. But yeah, I think because we've seen people act on that as well, and there've been documented stories about people acting on that. It's something we've seen as conspiracy theories, and we've also seen people act on it.
Indeed, yeah. Groups attacking towers and so on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Charles, thank you so much for that, and also Antonio as well. It's been a brilliant discussion, and thank you for speaking so sort of candidly and openly about your work at Facebook and your insights on the industry based on your career within it. It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, and featuring Antonio García Martínez and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.